Hello, my name is Elizabeth Eagleton Fong, and today I'm going to do one vowel rule and two vowel rule using color vowel chart vocabulary. Vowel letters A, E, I, O, U. First one, A. One vowel, A, says ah, black, cat, black cat. Two vowels, A, plus another vowel, say A. Gray. Day. Gray day. One A, black cat. Two vowels, AI, AY, A final E, say A. AI, rain. A final E, name. So we have the one vowel rule. One vowel, A, says, and this is the IPA symbol, ah. Keywords, black cat. How often does this rule work? 91%. Yay, that's good. Two vowel rule. Two vowels, AI, A final E, AY. Say the alphabet sound, and here I use the IPA symbol. A. Keywords, gray, day. How often does this work? AI says A 95% of the time. A final E says A 90% of the time. AY says A 93%. So we have A, now we're going to do E. E. One vowel E says red, dress, red dress. Two vowels, E, plus another vowel, say E. E, green. And EA, tea. Green tea. One E, red dress. Two vowels, EE, EA, E final E, like Pete. Say E, green tea. Also, final Y says E, like baby. I put this here because it final Y says E 95% of the time. Very good to know. Okay, one vowel rule, one E says red dress 82% of the time. Two vowel rule, E final E, EE, EA, and final Y say the alphabet sound E, green tea. So we have E final E is 32%, not so much. EE, 92, yes, very good. EA, 69%. And I want to pause here and look at that. So we have EA says E, like T, C, flea, bead. EA also says like head, bread. And this is closer to 21%. So this is also a pronunciation for EA. And lastly, again, final Y says E 95% of the time. So we have A, E, I. One vowel, I, says I. Silver. This is like my ring is silver, my earrings, silver. Silver. Pin. Pin. Silver pin. Two vowels, I, plus another vowel, say I. White. And IE, say I. Tie. White tie. One I, silver pin. Two vowels, I final E, IE, say I, white tie. Also, IGH says I, like light. I put this here because it's 100%. Yay! 100%. Very nice. One vowel rule. One I says I, silver pin, 93%. Two vowel rule. Two vowels, I final E, IE, and IGH, not two vowels, but it's a good rule. Say the alphabet sound I, white, tie. I final E is 77%. Okay. IE, not very often, but IGH, 100%. Very good. So we have A, E, I. Now we will look at O. O. One vowel, O, says ah, olive. This color green is from an olive. This is an olive. We call it olive green. So ah, olive. And sock, sock, olive, sock. Two vowels, O, plus another vowel, say O. O final E, rose. This color, pink, is from a rose. This is a pink rose. This is rose color. And coat, O-A, O, coat. Rose coat. One O, ah, olive sock. Two vowels, O-E, O-A, O-E, like toe. Say O, rose coat. Also, we have O-W, says O, like toe. So toe, toe, same sound, different spelling. One vowel rule. One O says ah, olive sock, 74%. Still good. Two vowel rule. O final E, O-A, O-W, not two vowels, but O-W. Say the alphabet sound, O, rose, coat. O final E, 76%. O-A, 94%. Very good. And O-W, about half, about 53. And this is why. O-W can say O, toe, row, slow. About 53%. But O-W can say E-A, ah, ow, how, bow, about 47%. Same spelling, O-W, different sound, O and ow. All right. A-E-I-O-U. One vowel, U, says mustard. This color is mustard. Like a hot dog, you have the sauce right here is mustard sauce. It's mustard yellow. Mustard. And cup. Cup. Mustard cup. two vowels, U, plus another vowel, say ooh. No U, just ooh. Blue. The U-E, ooh, blue. Blue. And here, O-O says ooh, moon. Moon. Blue moon. One U, mustard cup. Two vowels, U-E, U-I, like fruit, and U final E, like cute. Say, ooh, blue moon. We also have O-O, says ooh, and one U says ooh, like student. Okay, one vowel rule. One U says mustard cup, 66%. And that's because one U can say ooh, like student. Let's move on. Two vowel rule. U final E, U-E, and O-O say ooh, cute, blue, and moon. U final E say ooh, 94%. Very good. U-E say ooh, not so much. And O-O say ooh, 88%. Pretty good. Okay. Well, thank you for listening today. Good luck in your English studies. Bye-bye.